Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of RINSED. I hope you enjoyed part 1, and if you haven't yet seen part 1, it is kind of a prerequisite to part 2 and part 3, so I'd jump in on that now before getting started. Now, part 2 is really going to be continuing on from our chat around property, but elaborating this out further into more about what I believe to be the real crisis. So stay tuned. So if houses are going down in value when adjusted for money supply, why do property investors make so much money? And we can really clearly articulate that through what we know as financialization, which is the financialization of all these assets over time. With soft money or abundant money or money that is not scarce, houses go up in value relative to the money supply because houses are scarce compared to money. Remember, money is going up at 7 to 9% per annum, but housing supply is only increasing by 1 or 2% per annum. And so what property investors do is they buy a housing asset because it is a relatively hard housing asset. It's only going to increase in supply by 1 or 2% a year. And then they take a dollar short position, which is a mortgage or some sort of loan facility. And they then build equity through just the normal appreciation in the house price, absorbing that money supply. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance to this. There's property investors that do better than this. They find all the other parameters that extract money, that mean that houses will outperform the money supply over short periods of time, right? Is it close to favorable schools? Has it got good views? Is it east facing or north facing or south facing? All these parameters that do affect on a micro level an individual house's value, but at a macro level across the total population of houses, they broadly just absorb money supply, right? And so that is the signal. Everything else is kind of noise. And what we can see here is a general house investment over 5 years, where we've bought $1 million house, we've used 20% equity, and we've got 5 years of house appreciation at 6.6% per annum, right? Which means that in 5 years the house is worth close to 1.4 million. Now we've got nearly $600,000 in equity, and we can then use that newly minted equity to go purchase another house by leveraging up. And that was like the beautiful play of like the late 90s, early 2000s, where all these guys that were working at Domino's would go buy houses with 1% equity. The house would go up a little bit over 1 or 2 years. They'd suddenly have 2 or 3% equity. They'd leverage up again, and they'd rinse and repeat for 2 decades. And then they were suddenly very, very wealthy, right? This is the driver of it. This is why it was possible. And it can't continue to be possible. And so that's why it's become harder and harder. Financing's become more difficult. Higher equity deposits are now required, because if this were to continue to run, it would just get ridiculous. Now, I hope that kind of elucidates how property investors are making money despite houses becoming less valuable over time when adjusted for money supply. It is not because the houses are worth less. It is because we're able to financialize the houses with a softer, more abundant asset, that is the dollars that are increasing in supply at 7 to 9% per annum relative to the house at 1 to 2% per annum increase in supply. So it is basically relative scarcity. Now, this concept of relative scarcity is really relevant everywhere. And we can see this when we disaggregate our overall inflation signal. Now, over the past 20 years, we can look at the types of things or components that make up our consumer price inflation and understand of the overall inflation signal, what things have gone up faster than inflation, what things have gone down or gone up slower than inflation. And what we can see is broadly over these categories, relative scarcity is the core driver of relative inflation. Now, I want to ignore hospital, college tuition, and college textbooks, so kind of like a US issue thing, but this concept applies to New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, the UK, everywhere where we have this consumer price inflation. Things that are relatively scarce feature more prominently in consumer price inflation, and things that are like abundant and not scarce at all help to drive down the inflation signal. So what we have is essentials are essentially outpacing inflation, right? We've got medical care services, childcare, food and beverage, housing. These are all important things we need to live, things we need to enjoy our day with, right? But they're kind of scarce, we kind of need them. And so those things are outpacing inflation. And what we've got that are relatively abundant is our cell phones and software and toys and televisions, all this kind of consumer junk that gets piled into the consumer price inflation, but are really kind of luxuries or things that we don't really need, but they help to push down that inflation, that consumer price inflation signal, and our our central banks and our governments can say, hey, look, don't worry, iPads are cheaper, and therefore your inflation signal is low, even though you can't afford to buy groceries, right? And so that relative scarcity is what drives inflation. That drives it everywhere, and it seems to be this massive signal that permeates everything. And it's actually a massive distortion in our economy. So I want to come back to this slide for a second before I introduce the next core concept. Now, what we have is we have $376,000 of newly minted equity in this new house purchase example, right? Now, this $375,000 of equity, where has it come from? If money has been printed and the money has been diluted, and therefore it appears in the equity of houses, right? Because they're just absorbing the money supply. Where has that purchasing power come from, right? Like, printing money doesn't create wealth, it only reallocates it. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you where it's come from. So, where has that newly minted equity come from? Well, it has come from our wages. Now, we can look at Australia and New Zealand's minimum wage over the last 50 years, and we can see that we started at 70 cents to $1.50 over the 50 odd years ago. And to these days, I think the Australian minimum wage is around $24 and the New Zealand minimum wage is around $22.70 or whatever. Now, when we adjust these for money supply, we can see that actually, in fact, the annual income that people on minimum wage should be earning today is very different. In 2024, the Australian annual income and New Zealand annual income for a minimum wage worker is somewhere between 40 and 50,000 New Zealand or Australian dollars, right? But when we take the 1970 minimum wage and we adjust it for money supply and we adjust it for the population growth, then we can see that the Australian annual income on 1970's minimum wage is equivalent to around 250,000 Australian dollars today. And in New Zealand, it's somewhere between $290,000 to $300,000 New Zealand a year. And that reflects this massive increase in money supply. And this is why we as millennials or Gen Z look at boomers and think, man, they had it so easy. And it's because they did. I would rather make $1 an hour in 1970 than what I would rather make making $200,000 a year in a big fancy corporate job in New Zealand or Australia. And the reality is that explains exactly why we can't buy anything anymore, because the wages and salaries have been so massively debased. And it's not just minimum wage workers, right? It's high earning executives now whose wages have been so thoroughly debased that they're working their asses off in order to buy houses, right? If you think about like high-end corporate salaries 20, 30 years ago, these people were earning like a house a year, whereas even these days, those people don't earn that. And so this is a reflection of the debasement that we see, and that this arbitrary reallocation of wealth. We have this allocation from the laboring class, from the working class, and when I say laboring class, I don't just mean like people who are earning a wage. I mean anyone who is contributing labor for money in the economy. So that is anyone on minimum wage right up to a CEO. All these people, in my opinion, are the laboring class, and their incomes have been debased and reallocated into the equity of assets. And these graphs show it so clearly. If you're from the US or Canada, here's the exact same graphs again for the United States and Canada. Now, what we can see is that the US and Canada have similar outcomes where you need to be earning 160,000 Canadian dollars today to earn the same as what you would be earning in the in the Canada in 50 odd years ago. So we can disaggregate this analysis and we can look at it in terms of its components. We can look at it in terms of money supply per capita, and then minimum annual earnings, and then minimum wage adjusted for per capita money supply. And what we can see is that money supply has gone up per capita by 50 to 100 times over the last 53 years, while annual earnings has only increased 10 to 15 times on an annual basis. That is that the minimum wage has only gone up about 10 to 15 times in each of these countries. The US is kind of a special exception. They've had a really rough minimum wage. And this reflects that debasement. So what we can see is in the early 70s, right, you could earn 1.5 to 2.3 times the per capita money supply from a minimum wage job. Whereas nowadays it's closer to 0.2, 0.3 times the per capita money supply. Now, what that means is that your share of the economy continues to get diluted out, and that is through the use of an increasing money supply. And that is why you can't afford anything today. Here, I've got it again. This example here shows how the purchasing power is reallocated from wages and salaries into the equity of assets. So here we've got year one, current state, a $1 million house, $100,000 income. Maybe you're spending $80,000 a year on essentials and you're spending $20,000 on consumer products. Now, in scenario one, we've got 10% monetary inflation. That is, the money supply is increasing 10% per annum. And over the 10 years, houses would go up to $2 million. Your income might be $135,000 a year to reflect that, inflation adjustment that your employer might give you. But essentials are $130,000 a year, and consumer products up maybe $12,000 a year. Consumer products are generally getting cheaper. But your expenses now are $142,000 a year compared to your income at $135,000 a year. And today we have a cost of living crisis. Now let's flip this on its head and think of it in terms of no monetary inflation. What would all these prices do without the monetary inflation? So the house, it'd be $1 million today, and in 10 years, it might be about $800,000, right? So house prices have gone down. That reflects that houses don't hold their money against a fixed monetary supply. Your income would also go down, right? You'd have to take pay cuts. There'd be growth, there'd be an increase in population or whatever, and so your income might go down. So that would be about $90,000 a year. But again, essentials and your consumer products would also go down, and they would go down really fast. And so you might only be spending $50,000 a year on essentials and maybe $4,000 on consumer products, right? And so now you've got $50,000 a year of savings or $40,000 a year of savings, and you don't have this cost of living crisis. Now, this is very hypothetical, and it's just projecting out the general price increases that we see when we isolate for that monetary inflation signal. And so it's not to be taken as like the exact numbers, but it's here to illustrate a core concept and broadly what is occurring in our economy. When we have monetary inflation and we don't understand it and we don't account for it in our daily lives, over a period of a decade or two, we will have a cost of living crisis. And when we don't have monetary inflation, life tends to get easier. Expenses goes down, income goes down, rightly or wrongly, but also house prices go down and everyone's kind of happier. And it's not as stressful as what we experience today. There's not that same level of anxiety. So in summary, government has relied upon money creation as a large component of their funding for the last 50 years. While we talk about inflation reported at 1% to 2%, it has required a far more pernicious 7 to 9% annual monetary inflation. And in ways, New Zealand, Australia, and the rest of the world are sort of a victim of circumstance, right? We're having to debase our currency in line with the USA in order to avoid destimulating our own economies, right? If we weren't increasing our money supply, the New Zealand Australian dollars would become too valuable. It would become hard for us to trade in the global economy. And so we're kind of stuck and we kind of have to do it. Wealthy Kiwis and Australians have made money by being consistently dollar short and holding a relatively hard asset or a relatively scarce asset to this money supply, which has been housing. The equity created in these properties is purchasing power accrued from holders of cash, typically retirees, workers, salaried staffs, whose incomes are dollar denominated. And those are those graphs that I was showing you earlier. Our purchasing power from our incomes is being reallocated into asset prices. And so that is why we're experiencing a housing crisis. That is why we're experiencing a cost of living crisis. So I really hope you've enjoyed part 2 of RINSED. Stick around and we're going to release part 3 very soon. I'm going to link it in the description. Please like, subscribe, engage with this content, ask any questions if you want me to deep dive on anything any further. Cheers. Thanks everyone.